Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Great to be back. Now here to answer your questions tonight, Victorian Independent Senator Derryn Hinch, historian, Shakespearean and feminist Germaine Greer, the Assistant Minister for Immigration, Hawke, Shadow Minister for the Environment, Tony Burke, and Zimbabwean anti-poverty entrepreneur Chido Govera, who helped thousands find hope through mushroom farming. Please welcome our panel. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in Eastern Australia. It's live everywhere else on the ABC News channel at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. You can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope. Well, our first question comes from Kirsty Popple.
Hi, thank you. My question is directed to Hawke. We were halfway through our citizenship application when the shock announcement was made on Thursday. We finished it and lodged it on the Friday, but we're now really worried that we're going to have to wait another 3 years before we're eligible to apply and that our application will be refused. Now, there's a lot of people in a similar situation to us, and we'd like to ask the Immigration Minister to reconsider the criteria for eligibility in such an abrupt fashion and consider the impact that it's going to have on the families. Our Australian-born son will now be 8 if we have to wait a further 3 years to apply. Shouldn't you be giving hard-working, tax-paying, law-abiding immigrants like us a fair go?
Hawke.
Yeah, well, thank you, firstly, for the question, and absolutely, it gives me the opportunity to explain a little bit about what will happen to people who've got applications in or missed the deadline, and also what we're doing in relation to some of the changes. So, in relation to the application, the government has said that if you had an application lodged prior to the announcement, that will proceed as per the application that you put in at the time. If, of course, you've missed that deadline, there are very good reasons when you make changes of this nature, whether it be citizenship or whether it be with foreign workers, why you don't want to do that prospectively, because you'll have effectively a rush of people try and qualify under the old system. And
let's just quickly find out, did you miss the deadline?
Well, we were halfway through doing the application because it's quite a lengthy process. There's a lot of information to get together. And so we were halfway through when the announcement was made. So we finished it on the Friday because there was so much traffic on the Thursday. And yeah, we managed to submit it and pay on the Friday. So we're just unsure of whether we're going to be refused or accepted.
Okay.
Well, if it was made...
are they going to be refused or accepted?
Well, I won't make that here tonight, but what we'll do is we'll take that up and look at exactly when it was lodged. It had to have been lodged prior to the announcement, so we'll have a look at that for you. And if there's been some...
We started it prior to the announcement, but we didn't actually click the submit button.
Yeah, okay, and look, I won't, without the full information or the facts, make a decision here on air for you tonight. What we'll do in those sort of cases, there will be the availability for people to contact the department, to contact the government and to put that case forward. Now, you may be in a crossover period, but you may not. But what we have said is that from 20th of April, if you've applied already, then you'll apply under the old system. So, yeah, I'm happy to take that on board for you.
So will there be some appeal system in here for people like that?
Well, there'll always be appeals for people, but, you know, those processes will be outlined as this develops. I mean, you know, we have to put a hard deadline on it. When we make changes of this nature, any kinds of changes of this nature, we have to put a hard deadline on when people can make an application. And, you know, we understand there'll be some people impacted by this, but the requirements we're putting forward in setting a higher bar on Australian citizenship have the support of the public. They've been widely consulted over many years. They're to put a higher standard on Australian citizenship.
No one expected this, of course, and so just a quick question to follow up as part of that question anyway. What exactly is the point of making migrants wait an extra 3 years to become citizens?
Well, Tony, this brings us into line with a lot of other countries around the world where we want to get to know people who want to become prospective citizens a little better. That means we need to understand that they are going to be integrating, that they want to send their kids to Australian schools. These will be the things that will be tested, that they fit in with the community. And, of course, you need some time to do that. And the time requirements, whether you go to Canada or the UK or other countries, are longer than Australia. It's been the case in Australia that you've been able to use your temporary visa time to then qualify for the waiting period.
Let's quickly go back to Kirsty. Do you feel that you're integrating in Australia?
Oh, absolutely. We've been here 7, 8 years now. We've had 2 kids here, so all they know is Australia. They go to school here. We volunteer at the local rugby league club, and our son plays there. So we're very much a part of the community, just like any Australian.
Kirsty, in your question, you said that you know a lot of people in similar situations.
Yeah, well, just from the on the forums and things, there's a lot of people like us who were in the process of applying. And when we go through a lot to get to permanent residency status, and we are expecting that we'll be able to go for our citizenship after a year, and then to move it and say we need to wait another 3 years. What if you move it again in another 2.5 years? And my son will be 8, and he's an Australian.
Okay, let's hear from some of the other panellists, and first of all, the politicians. Tony Burke.
Well, I respect, Alex, that you're not wanting to answer the question on the run, but certainly the documents that the government has released would make it pretty clear that Kirsty's now got to wait 3 years. That's what the government documents say will happen. Look, in fairness to you, Kirsty, no, it's not about you. The announcement's not about you. It's about Newspol. And this,
So what do you need to explain that. If you say it's about Newspol, what aspect of Newspol are you talking about?
Okay, really simple. At the end of last year, there was a big immigration announcement in the lead up to Newspol. We were told that it would be a disaster for national security unless we agreed to a new rule that said anyone who'd arrived by boat would never even be allowed to come to Australia as a tourist. The announcement was made, we talked about it all week, the legislation went through the House of Representatives, never heard of again. Government never returned to it, just disappeared. This one, we have another Newspol weekend coming up, and so we have a week leading up to it of a series of immigration and citizenship announcements.
OK, now, Alex Hawke, you get to respond to that, and I suppose if it were related to Newspol, would it be related to the fact that One Nation now has 10% of the primary vote and your primary vote is dropping?
Look, Tony Burke, to suggest this has got anything to do with Newspol is completely and utterly incorrect. And it's a fatuous line to suggest that changes to Australian citizenship that will affect the entire process, the way that people become Australian citizens, has anything to do with any individual poll. And I think everybody here can see that that's a pretty fatuous sort of line. These changes are about, in 2017, what requirements do we put on citizens? And the feedback from the Australian community, we've had consultation processes in 2015, we've had a productivity commission report into migration, and we've had many different points of feedback from the Australian community. In 2017, people want a higher bar on Australian citizenship. And, you know, the threat environment has changed post 9/11. We've seen great changes in the mass movement of people, temporary migrants, people wanting to move countries, and it's reasonable for the federal government. It's actually a prime responsibility of the federal government to set up citizenship as something that is valued and appreciated by people. And that is the purpose of these changes.
In terms of how you judge the success of this, will you watch Newspol and see if your primary vote goes up?
We certainly won't. And the Howard government made changes in relation to citizenship, and we are, again, as a responsible coalition government, making changes in relation to Australian citizenship.
Okay.
Can I just make the point, Tony?
Sure.
They are
Briefly,
reasonable
we want to hear
changes.
from other
And
panellists.
if Tony has an objection to any one of the changes that we are making, he should state his objection to them. But he will acknowledge they are reasonable benchmarks for us to set in Australia.
Anyone with their telephone on in here can turn it off now. Thank you very much. Now, Derryn, quickly.
Well, I think that some of the changes are good and are going to hurt some people. I know that's coming along the way. But, I mean, I became an Australian citizen 35 years ago and it was far too easy. You didn't need police checks. You didn't have to worry about you can lie in your applications. You didn't have to fill in a question. I didn't have to know what Don Bradman's batting average was or any of that stuff. So I think it was too easy. So some of these changes I think are good, and they are talking to the community about it. And the biggest thing though is that if you lie in your application and then you commit a crime in Australia down the track, they've got that hidden weapon to go back and throw you out of the country because you lied originally, and that hasn't been utilised much. It's being done now against some New Zealanders, and it's right and it's working.
All right, let's go to another question that brings us to some of the issues around what new citizens will be required to do. The question is from Katie Lang.
This is regarding the new citizenship test. So how is the multiple choice test able to test one's commitment to values when values are expressed in one's actions?
We'll start with you, Alex.
Yeah, well, certainly it's not going to be just a multiple choice test. The test on values will be there, and that will help us identify people that have consistent views with things that we think are core Australian values: respect for the rule of law, democracy, the equality of men and women, all of these features that we are non-controversial in Australian values. Now, you say, how is it going to do that? Well, just like any test does that. People fail the current test. I'll make it very, very clear. Even though the current test is a civics test, thousands of people fail the current test. And what we are saying is if you fail the test 3 times, you'll be unable to reapply for citizenship for 2 years.
Give us just
Why?
very briefly, well, we'll come back to that in a minute. Very briefly, what new questions do you expect to be in the test? We've seen the Australian has helpfully been provided with some of those proposed questions from the Immigration Department. What key new questions?
Well, the test will be around Australian values. There's existing tests, and as we've said, one of the criticisms of the current test is that it's been more civics than about values. Now, we've seen some examples in the media. The government will, of course, release and consult further with the test. It will be put out in due course. But the point is, it's not just a simple test that you pass. There are a series of things involved in gaining Australian citizenship.
Okay, we'll come to more of that.
Germaine, I think they're important. Character and other questions.
Okay.
It's not just a test. I just don't want anyone to get the impression one test and you've become an Australian citizen. There's a series of requirements.
Okay, I apologise. Germaine.
Well, it's a bit odd, isn't it? Because half of us who are born here wouldn't pass the bloody test.
I don't agree with that.
I mean, it is extraordinary. But the same thing happens elsewhere. I have to confess now something that irritates me, that I now have dual citizenship. Because after years of seeing me standing with a face like thunder at the airport, the poor old immigration people said, look, why don't you just get citizenship? And I said, well, I don't want it. It was good enough for my father to fly for the RAF with his old passport, and it's good enough for me to get in and out of his country and pay your grotesque taxes. And they said, oh, don't be like that. Just, I said, I'm not eligible because I'm in Australia too often. You've got to be 90 days max out of the country. But then they said, just do it. Don't be such a pain in the ass. We're sick of seeing you here. So I did it.
This is a relief for some people because this means you can't be a politician in Australia.
Oh, exactly.
Because you're a dual citizen now, so that relieves some people.
Oh, yeah, but that itself is an odd thing. But anyway, so the thing is I did it. But then I had to I didn't have to do the test. There was a test where you were asked if you understood the game of cricket. And they said I didn't have to do that because I clearly did understand the game of cricket, which I don't.
Germaine, just in terms of whether you're allowed to be an Australian or not, do you know who the Australian cricket captain is?
No.
I'll give you a hint. His name is Smith.
Steve.
No, doesn't help.
Steve Smith.
Well,
Don Bradman. So how about Don Bradman? You know who he is?
He'll only be there for a minute. I mean, you come and go. I never know who's going to be. But the odd thing was that we had to do this dreadful ceremony where we had to take an oath. And I had to swear to honour the Queen or respect or do something to the Queen. And I thought, this is outrageous. English people don't have to be loyal. They don't have to be royalists. They can be Republicans. But I, as an Australian with dual citizenship, have to be a royalist. I mean, it's all bollocks.
Well, here's a question you might be asked, according to the Immigration Department. You might be asked if you were to become an Australian citizen in the future. Under what circumstances is it permissible to strike your spouse in the privacy of your own home?
Is it permissible? Is somebody giving you a permit?
Under what circumstances?
Never, I would say. But it's also not permissible to bash your children. But the British have fought the EU on this issue for years. They insist on the right to belt their kids. And it's illegal under EU human rights legislation, which is one of the more bizarre reasons that they're leaving the EU. It almost got them to behave decently, and they're out of there.
I just want to hear from Chido, listening to this. Are you surprised that we should be having a debate as to what it takes to become an Australian?
I am surprised because I have the understanding that we are living in a world that's becoming more global, and that, if anything, we should be looking to see how we can actually foster this aspect of being global and to find a way of working together to find, I mean, talking about values, values are something the world over is caring about. And I think it would be more interesting to become more open to say, in view of the world becoming global, how can we work together, welcoming those who are coming in? And of course, there are also Australians who are going out, and letting this exchange happen to be able to learn and to actually be able to build the resilience we need to survive in a global world.
Are you saying this sounds a bit insular to you?
Absolutely.
Well,
Yes. Yes.
In a word, yes.
You're being a bit polite. No, OK, Tony Burke, the question was about the tests, and I'll actually come back to our questioner in a minute because I'd like to hear what you think about the tests and the proposed questions. But what do you think about the questions that are being proposed, the new ones that we're starting to hear about in the newspapers?
Well, a couple of things, because I was challenged on something specifically by Alex a moment ago, which I do want to respond to. If what Derryn said is true, that having some of these questions makes a difference in terms of what you can do if someone subsequently is involved in domestic violence or something like that, then that's a pertinent point when we work through this. And questions that might otherwise seem, why on earth are you asking that? There may be reasons behind it. I don't know yet. We haven't seen the legislation.
Well, I mean, one thing we do know, that it appears there'll be questions about child marriage, genital mutilation and striking your spouse. Are they likely to feed fears about Islam or answer fears about Islam?
Well, certainly domestic violence is a challenge across the whole of our country, and any attempt to narrow down domestic violence as anything other than a national crisis, I think, is a misrepresentation of what we're dealing with.
But are you suggesting that might be the case here?
Yeah. Well, no, you just put that to me, and I'm saying that I don't accept whether a reference to domestic violence should ever be seen.
But the three things together, genital mutilation, domestic violence, striking your spouse, and considering the background of those women from Hizb ut-Tahrir who put out the video saying that it's okay for their husbands to strike them, do you think these things are related?
Whether they're related in terms of motivation is an issue for the government to say. They have claimed that they're not related in terms of motivation. Issues that you go through are not issues that characterise Islam.
Tony,
I'll come back to you, I promise.
This is a deliberately loaded gun, and I support the government on it, because if you say yes or no on your application about domestic violence or child marriage, which is child rape, and then you are, and genital mutilation, if down the track you are found to have been involved in any of that, the government can go back and say, you lied on your application, therefore it's a fraud, and we can deport you. And I think that's a wise thing to have. It's an insurance policy for the government, and I applaud them for it.
So just going back to the question I asked Tony Burke, do you think that fear of Islam has anything to do...
Yes, I do. I think the government is fudging this. I think that's what it's there for, but I accept it and I applaud it.
Germaine Greer, do you accept that?
No, I don't really, because it's not Islam. And it's the sort of caricature of Islam that we keep promulgating. But all of this is weird. I mean, one of the commonest operations in the United States is reduction of the labia minora. And it costs you $8,000 or something, and it's carried out massively, huge, thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases a year.
And do you class that as genital mutilation?
Well, I class circumcision as genital mutilation. Sorry, guys. If you're going to really deal with this question of genital mutilation, start paying attention. Find out what happens to human genitalia. It's not pretty, and you mightn't like it. But you're going to be in a pretty silly situation if you start, you know, doing the, what did we used to call it, the short arm test at the at the passport control. Let me see if you've been mutilated. And why does that particular mutilation have this kudos? Why is it such an important thing? Why does God like it? I don't think God likes it at all. I think God should take issue.
Because supposedly with male circumcision, it was for health reasons. Child circumcision on mutilation of little girls is to prevent them from having sexual pleasure later in life. Now, I went to Africa 30 years ago to write stories about female genital mutilation. And I'll tell you what happens. Some old crone comes round with a knife. She's usually held down by the mother, the girl held down by the mother or the grandmother. And then when they've mutilated the little girl, they then stick cow dung on the wound to form a scab and tie her legs together. And that's a child of 8 or 9 or 10. That's what it's about. That's not about a religious thing of men having circumcision for health reasons.
OK, let's go back to the Minister. Now, Alex, you've heard the suggestion that this is actually about allaying fears about Islam and certain practices among parts of the community. Is that what this is all about?
What this is about is ensuring that when people become Australian citizens, they're in step with Australian values. Now, some of these things we're talking about, Tony, and I think if you listen to them very carefully, I don't believe there's anybody in this room that would support the practice of child marriage, for example. It's now against Australian law. But recently in Australia, we've had to take measures to improve our laws to ensure that this is captured within Australian law. And yet we want to make sure when people arrive in Australia, they understand that if they want to become an Australian, they have to be in step with core Australian values. It isn't about any particular religion, it isn't about any particular race, but it is about people realising they come from all over the world, from cultures with very different backgrounds and very different experiences. It's about saying our Australian culture doesn't accept these things, and if you want to become an Australian, you have to assimilate and integrate into Australian society.
And yet our courts do sometimes go along with this. 2 weeks ago in Melbourne, there was a man, 34-year-old, last year married a 14-year-old girl, right? Because of financial reasons or whatever, and the plea bargaining situation which has developed in Australia, he was plea bargained down. The sexual assault, the child rape charges were dropped, and instead he was charged, which he could have got 25 years jail for. Instead, he's going to be charged with breaching the Marriage Act, and that'll be plea bargained down. He may get a year in jail.
OK. Chido, you're listening to this, obviously, with great intent. I mean, you were almost a child bride yourself.
Yes, I was. So I do agree that the values of avoiding child marriages and genital mutilation are very important. But then how does these rules then relate to an Australian who is marrying a child here in Australia? You have no way to deport them to. How do you deal with that? We say that with people who are coming in, you can deport them, you can send them away. When you see that they lied, they say they will not do this, they have done it. What about Australians here who are actually going against, who are involved in child marriages? How do you plan to deal with that in view of?
Well, absolutely, it's against the law, and we've had to take. And this is the first time in Australia we've had to actually pass specific laws about this to deal with this new phenomena where people are coming here from these backgrounds with some of these attitudes that are completely out of step with contemporary Australian values.
So I still want to put just one right on this point. Are you saying that these questions will be on every application, or they will be one of the random questions that sometimes appears in a test?
Look, I'm not going to answer any questions about the specific test today.
Well, it makes a big difference.
For obvious reasons. For obvious reasons.
Germaine, just hang on a second.
But Germaine, no one here, and you're not saying, and we're not disagreeing on this practice, we're not disagreeing on this value. I know you, Tony, and you don't disagree with me on this. So again, what is your objection to us making sure that new Australian citizens understand that this is against Australian values?
No, well, and I don't.
You don't.
Disagree. No, I don't disagree with that.
None of us disagree on this.
The issue that I am concerned about. Okay.
Maybe Germaine does, but nobody else does.
But the thing you're assuming is that in child marriage there will be sexual intercourse. Now, if you actually look at the background to the way in which families marry, say, in village India, it's not expected that the little girl will be subject to sexual intercourse. That will be controlled by her mother-in-law probably, and access to the child will only be allowed when she's considered to be old enough to be able to deal with it.
14.
And this, well, that used to be the British age.
Germaine, I'm going to pause you there because we've got quite a few questions to get through and on different subjects. But Tony Burke needs to finish his point.
Thank you. Two things that I don't understand. I don't understand why someone who has trouble with passing a test and keeps trying and keeps trying and keeps trying gets told, oh, sorry, you failed the first 3 times, you're out. I don't understand how that's in Australia's interest. I also don't understand why, and you referred before to a changing security environment, everyone we're talking about is already a permanent resident. So they're already permanently here. How is it in the national interest to delay people taking a formal pledge of allegiance to the nation, which they take when they become citizens. Those two things I don't understand.
Okay, a brief answer on that. It is an important point. People wonder why you need to delay this. The word from the Prime Minister is about integration.
Absolutely right, and this is the whole point of the Turnbull government's approach in multiculturalism and in our migration system, and that is making sure people assimilate and integrate into our society. Now, what is the point? Well, the point is Australian citizenship is valuable, and it ought to have a value attached to it, and it ought to be reflective of Australian society. We are not disagreeing on values on this panel. You're attempting to say, why should someone be out after 3 failures? They're not out in a cricket sense. They are banned from applying for 2 years. And why is that? Well, that is because we have assessed after you've had 3 failures that you have failed 3 times and that you haven't gotten through the process. So therefore we're saying, go away, spend 2 years and think about it and come back with Australian values. OK,
well, I think we've got an answer to that question. Now, the next question is a video from Sarah Tarper in Sydney.
Mr Hawke, as an immigration lawyer, I am at the coalface of managing the visa changes the Prime Minister announced on Tuesday. My question relates to the government's sudden decision to abolish 216 occupations from the skilled occupation list for 457 and other skilled visas. Many of these occupations are relied upon by my clients in the banking and finance, manufacturing, ICT, medical research and renewable energy sector. Can you please explain the logic of scrapping these occupations with no prior notice or consultation, and how is this good for business, particularly in the context of driving Australia's innovation agenda?
Alex Hawke.
Well, this is about Australians getting access to the Australian labour market first, primarily, in many of those professions. This has been a problem, a vexed issue with business and industry, and Australians know this is a challenge in our modern economy, that there are too many occupations on the current list. And it hasn't been updated overall since 2012 when it was first implemented. And when you look at the kinds of occupations that are there, when you look at the requirements that are there, too many Australians are being overlooked for jobs, and too many Australians in some of those fields that have been mentioned right there haven't been offered those jobs, whether they're new graduates out of our universities or whether they're people who are older in life who get made redundant and replaced by foreign workers.
Just to pick up one of the points the questioner asked, why was there no prior notice or consultation with businesses that are relying on these workers?
Well, once again, I just say there have been extensive public reviews about this. The Labor Party had a review in 2008 that was conducted. We had the Azarias review in 2015 with submissions from industry, from the unions, from business. John Azarias conducted that review across the whole of our society. And we've also had input from the Ministerial Advisory Council on Migration, which has extensively looked through many of the components of these changes. Okay. Now, that consultation, again, once again, if Australia's going to change its foreign worker system, it is not a good idea to advertise the specifics of that change, the timing, or when it is in advance. It leads to a rush on things, and what the government's prime focus here is ensuring Australians get the opportunities to access those jobs where they have been denied access to jobs.
Okay, we've got a question from someone with specific concerns. Before I bring in the other panellists, I'll hear from Gordon Hines.
Thanks, Tony. I've been leading a charge to bring to Australia scientists from America to co-develop battery technology. The technology is likely to lead to enabling renewable energy to work 24/7, and for a factory to be based in Newcastle, which will employ over 400 people. I suspect that the new requirements of the 457 visas probably going to make this project harder to implement, because the scientists may have trouble qualifying and they'll have a harder time gaining entry, as will the technicians to build a high-tech facility. Shouldn't Australia be embracing opportunities to co-develop programs with the best in the world and not increasing our crippling xenophobic attitude that creates this Australia First mantra?
Alex Hawke, you, and then we'll hear from the others.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I don't agree with you on some of that. I think there will still be 2 streams available to people under the new system. And of course, there has to be the capacity for business and people like yourself to bring in people from overseas who are highly skilled, where there is a skills shortage here. But this temporary work visa has always been about skills shortages in Australia, where we can't find Australians to do it.
Isn't that what he's saying?
Well, absolutely.
Well, let's just find out, actually. Gordon Hines, questioner. Can't you find Australian workers to build?
Well, you'll get Australian workers as part of the labour force for the factory, but it's the research project in particular that drives it all. So you're getting top people out of MIT, out of Boston, and they're experts in electrochemistry, and we just don't have those people here. But it also creates that broader. My fear is that it's hard enough to get Australians to be enthusiastic at all about embracing international collaboration. The finance community is really a very big laggard in that area. They just want to buy equities and invest in mature businesses.
Okay, we're going to have to.
So I'm just saying that it's about getting high-tech specialty people to this country is not easy. So don't make it harder.
Okay, well, I'll come back to you in a minute. I want to hear from others. So Tony Burke.
Okay. In terms of the frame for temporary work visas, you want to make sure that a temporary work visa is being used for genuine skills shortage. That's what you need to make sure of, and never being used as a way of undercutting wages. Because if it's being used to undercutting wages, that's bad for the worker who gets exploited and bad for the worker who gets displaced. No. I'm explaining the frame of it. What you've described is something that appears to fit directly within the skills frame. Now, I don't know obviously I don't know the project that you refer to, but if it's directly within the skills frame, if it's not able to be dealt with from within Australia and it's not covered, then that's something the government should look at.
You see, Tony, under this same, going back to what Tony's saying, the 457 visa situation got out of hand because under your government, Bill Shorten handed out more 457s than anybody, and in the end, we had kids coming in on 457s working at McDonald's and KFC. That's not what it was designed to do. It was designed to get the people that you're talking about to do those special jobs. And that's the way I agree with you on that part. That's the way it should be run out now. The second point is, I always thought that 457s, you've used the word temporary about 3 times, was a temporary visa for a job shortage.
Absolutely.
But I'm told now that everybody who gets a 457 thinks it's a golden road to citizenship.
Well,
and that's not what it's
and I need to...
Just before both of you answer that, we've actually got a question that related precisely to that. We'll quickly go to David Butt, and then we'll come back to you. Go ahead, David.
Rural and remote communities are highly dependent on overseas trained doctors and other health professionals, and will be for many years ahead. One of the main motivations for doctors and other health professionals to come to Australia on 457 visas is the chance to seek citizenship. Without that incentive of citizenship, they're less likely to come. So how do we ensure that people living in rural and remote Australia have access to services when the incentive for doctors and other health professionals is reducing?
So I can address this straight away, and there's no change to this. Obviously, the requirement for GPs to go to rural and regional areas for 5 years has been a good one. It's been part of the system that has worked, and Derryn is right. There are some parts of the system that have not worked, where Australians have missed out on opportunities, and we're fixing it. And we're certainly reducing the number of foreign workers in Australia.
So would you be encouraging doctors to come here thinking that they could become citizens? That seems to be the point of that question.
Well, certainly there are pathways. There are pathways to permanent residency, pathways to citizenship if people want to come, and the service they provide in rural and regional areas, that incentive was there not just to make people go to a rural or regional area for 5 years only. It was there to hopefully they would want to stay in a rural and regional area. But let me just go back to this point about this. The AMA itself says that in our cities, and this is the key point about all of the government's 457 changes and moving to a new system, we graduate more than enough GPs for our cities. So we have been importing people, foreign doctors that come and end up in cities. That doesn't help. We don't have a skill shortage in GP. What we have is a skill shortage in rural and regional areas. Right. Now, we've got an incentive there that is staying, and there will be no change to that, so you can be absolutely sure.
I just want to go back to the questioner, David Butt. I mean, do you accept that?
Oh, no, I think the incentive for people to come to Australia, for highly skilled health professionals to come to Australia when that potential for citizenship is disappearing, will be less, and there'll be much...
What makes you think it's disappearing if the Minister says there's no change?
It's unchanged.
Because it's actually part of their current 457 arrangements, and it's not part of the 2- and 4-year arrangements that you're putting in place. But the other point you're making, I mean, 40% of GPs in rural and remote Australia are actually overseas trained, so most of them actually do go to rural and remote areas.
It's one of the features of the system that works. I think we're agreeing here, under the new system, that those doctors will be able to come work in rural and remote areas on the skills list, and they'll be able to qualify for permanent residency after 3 years on a medium to long-term stream. Now, I haven't had the chance to explain the two new streams, but I can just briefly do that. You'll have a short-term stream of 2 years where you can apply for a genuine skill shortage on the short-term list, which means you only come for 2 years, you work for 2 years, you can apply for one more 2-year short-term visa, and then you have to go home. There is no pathway to permanent residency. The second stream is medium or long term, which would, I think, capture the people that you were talking about, depending on their skill sets and some of the requirements, which is a 4-year visa, and after you've served 3 years, you have a pathway to permanent residency as well as per the current system.
Okay, we've got quite a few concerns about this issue. Let's go to Leanne Shao, who's sitting right next to David Butt. Go ahead.
Thank you. I will first add a quote from the film called The Big Short. The quote is, "I have a feeling in a few years, people are going to be doing what they always do when the economy tanks. They will be blaming immigrants and poor people." So my question for Mr. Minister is, could we consider this week's announcement would be the first step the government is taking to put their fingers on the immigrants? Or may I ask again, that is it just an action, just another action to improve the voting performance? Thank you.
Okay, before I'm not going to go to you first, even though he directed it to you. I'd like to hear from some of the other panellists. We'll come back to you. Germaine, Greer, what do you think? Obviously, there are concerns here that immigrants are being targeted by these rules, or potential citizens. What do you think?
I'm actually more worried about a different aspect of this, which is that all our overseas trained doctors have been trained at enormous expense in poor countries where they can't really get the support they need for the kind of allopathic practice that they've been trained for. And that we are profiting by this. We are draining off these people. And the idea that they're going to turn around and go back to the countries they came from and do the job they were originally trained to do is just nonsense. That isn't going to happen. And I've always worried about...
So are you suggesting that they shouldn't be allowed to stay in Australia?
I think there ought to be probably more awareness of what it's costing the countries who are supplying these health professionals, for example. I mean, the real problem about the visas in this case was that they were being rorted, I thought, and that they were being used to get you backpackers to run, you know, hotels in Alice Springs, and that wasn't the general idea. Although without the backpackers, I don't know how you're going to run the hotels in Alice Springs. So I just don't
We are talking about different things. Chido, what do you think?
No, no.
Different visas. What do you think about you're hearing the whole argument? I mean, you've made a case earlier for the global citizenry, and now you're hearing that we're tightening rules, that doctors coming here may or may not be able to remain as citizens, and if Germaine's point of view is to be taken into account, they should not be able to anyway because they're being drained away from countries like Zimbabwe.
I think that's, I mean, it's the same problem where it seems the rules are not made just for the sake of having the rules to control how things happen. It feels like it's all geared to isolate a certain group of people from coming to Australia, and that if they come, there was a mention of they come to work in rural Australia and they should not be in the cities. So they sort of, so they come from other countries, and then we keep them in a small spot where they cannot grow and go above that. They stay in the rural areas and they cannot come into in the city. That's a bit difficult to digest for me, knowing that then this is maybe part of my people who are being spoken about in this way, where they work very hard to be in a space where they can also grow, but there's no chance for that. And I think rules which are made like this are a little bit difficult because, again, it will lead us to the whole cycle of blaming. So it's blaming the immigrants, blaming the poor people. And I think we need to, it would be just nice to reflect on how and why we are building these rules, how we are putting these rules in place, and without just rules are not supposed to be built from a point of just isolating the other, but we need to have an overall overview of why we're doing it.
So Tony, Germaine mentioned the brain drain, right? Which reminds me of when Piggy Muldoon, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Robert Muldoon, he was once asked if he was worried about the immigration, the number of New Zealanders coming to Australia. And he said, not at all. He said, it improves the IQ of both countries.
Well, I'm sure that one's going to promote a few tweets over in New Zealand, but we'll just leave that for the time being. Tony Burke, just picking up the point of the question, do you think there is any kind of dog whistle going on here? That seemed to be the suggestion that certain immigrants are being targeted, that when things get tough, poor people and immigrants get targeted.
There are two separate issues with these announcements. One is the policy itself, which is something that a lot of it hasn't been seen, a lot of it we haven't seen the legislation, we still have to work through. The other is the motivation, the rhetoric around it. It's interesting with the example given of focus on immigrants, then focus on poor people. You read today's papers, it's poor people who are wrecking the budget. And on the arguments that are put there today, but no mention of whether or not it's affordable to give tax cuts to the top end of town. Is this a game that the government plays with its rhetoric? Yes, but that doesn't mean you necessarily knock back every policy that comes through that, because you've got to look at the detail, because sometimes the policies themselves aren't as over the top as the rhetoric. That
at the very beginning of the discussion, you said this is about the news poll. If it's about the news poll, what is it that the government is trying to achieve? What position are they trying to shift?
Well, the classic example as to how it's about the other was before when Alex made reference to this being relevant to the current national security situation. I don't for the life of me see how the announcement can be relevant to the national security situation when everybody we're talking about is a permanent resident and they're here anyway. How on earth can it be we're making a decision about whether or not someone should be in Australia as a citizen when the only people we're talking about have already been decided to be permanent residents? Of course it's not about national security. It might still be sensible. There might still be aspects of it that are sensible. But the rhetoric claiming that somehow people who are permanent residents and they've had their security checks and we've decided they're fine to live here, but if we make them citizens, they'll suddenly become dangerous, it's absurd.
Okay, now now it's back to you, because...
Well, I don't accept that construct, but, I just want to go back to the question, because I thought that was put to me directly, and I can assuage your fears in relation to this. It's not about any particular ethnicity, and it's certainly not anti-immigrant, because these are temporary visas, foreign workers. These have never been about permanent visas. This has always been a temporary skills shortage program. Now, there are pathways to permanent residency that have been attached to it, because recognising that when people do come here and work for substantial periods of time, that they should be able to have a pathway to permanent residency. But the changes we're making are non-discriminatory across the board. They don't impact any particular background. It's all about making sure that when Australians graduate at universities, they're offered the opportunities in Australia for Australian jobs first. And the most important change that I want everyone to understand that we've made is that you have to have a 2-year work experience now in our new temporary skills visa. And what that will mean is that you won't have university graduates competing with new graduates here in Australia for those jobs that exist here in Australia.
Is there Tony Burke mentioned national security. Is there, in your view, a national security?
I haven't raised it in relation to 457 workers, but of course, in the post-9/11 world, in relation to citizenship, moving back a step to a previous topic, of course there is a new environment where every country is wrestling with its citizenship and issues of integration and assimilation. Absolutely, it's a key theme. Security in our modern world is a theme facing so many of our countries, and these are part of the measures to improve our security.
With the 457s, I mean, go back some months now, when we were debating the building code and the ABCC, Nick Xenophon and I, with the support of Labor, managed to get the government to agree to some amendments, which meant that if you want to try and get a 457 person in here, you had to advertise it nationally for some time and had to prove that an Australian couldn't do the job. Now, so that was being kicked around 8 months ago.
Okay, all right, we're going to move along from immigration policies. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. Keep an eye on our Twitter account and the Conversation website for fact checks by the experts. The next question comes from Trish Marinozzi.
Hi, my question's for Chido. Through your experiences, how can mushroom farming help those in developing communities overcome poverty, and can these methods be applied to developed nations?
Chido.
My answer to that is yes. They contribute in a large way to ending poverty, because in the communities where I work, a lot of the hungry people there have an abundance of the same kind of waste material which we use to grow mushrooms. So they are hungry, but they have corn stalks everywhere in the fields. They have corn cobs everywhere. And if they are coffee farmers, for example, who are growing coffee which is sold abroad, and a lot of the people don't actually have the experience of drinking coffee or the appreciation of it, but they have waste from coffee which they can convert into mushrooms. And if they don't eat mushrooms directly, they can bring the mushrooms to a market where they can earn an income, which in many cases is always better than what they're earning from a cash crop they are growing. And then with that, they can start rebuilding their lives and contribute on their own to ending poverty. Can this be replicated in other parts of the world? Yes. We have seen a very good example of the work that we've done with coffee. We followed through the value chain of coffee, and we found that in the inner cities, which means in Sydney, in cities in America where they are drinking coffee, in cities in Europe where they're also drinking coffee, there's still quite the bulk of the coffee waste which is left there. And you have, of course, problems of jobs and stuff like that in the inner cities as well.
You're saying you can grow mushrooms in the coffee waste?
In the coffee waste from the cafe, you can grow mushrooms there. And we've worked to actually really simplify the whole process so that even in a shipping container in the middle of the city, you can be able to take coffee grounds from a cafe and grow mushrooms. So yes, mushrooms play a very, very big role in fighting poverty where I come from. And one of the most important things for us is also that the ability they provide to rebuild the topsoil, which is one of the major issues in our world today.
Chido, can I just get you, for those who don't know, can I get you to tell us how this started for you? Because I think it was the age of 8, you became an orphan.
7.
Your mother, 7?
Yeah.
You were out on the streets begging after that, as far as I understand it.
I was in the village doing what every village girl has to do, including being offered to marry when I was 10.
Yeah. So how did it all change for you? Because this idea or the training to learn how to grow mushrooms came as a chance for you and a few other young people in your village. But just tell us how that happened.
Well, I learned to farm mushrooms when I was 11 years old, and this was after I actually escaped being married off so that I can have food. When I learned to farm mushrooms, I also got the moment where I realized that by using what is locally available in my community, I can start changing things. And so I learned to simplify the art of cultivating mushrooms so I can share it with all the people who need it, just like I did. And this is what I'm doing today. I am building around in different communities around Zimbabwe, small mushroom houses for women who normally would not have easy access to land, young girls who are left as orphans and they are left with nothing and they have no access to land, partnering with some women in the communities who might have ownership to land and helping them to make something out of waste that can be used as a food that can be used to raise an income.
Germaine, let me bring you in on this. What do you think about this notion and the kind of enterprise that we're talking about here?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm sort of thinking, how would I feel if I had nothing to eat but mushrooms? Which I realise is extravagant of me to think that way. And I'm not really sure of the nutritive value of mushrooms. Oh. Are you going to tell me that they're amazingly good for you?
They have been good for me, that's for sure.
Are they the answer to starvation in certain countries? I mean, to put it at a higher level.
I mean, they help us to start to do something with what we have. Most of the times we have had to wait until someone comes from outside and tells us what to do and how to do it, when and where. And right now, with mushrooms, we create an opportunity for communities that would not have any of the big organizations getting there and making them do something. And something that helps us to go beyond handouts, where somebody comes with a bag of corn and we have it, and a lot of things that we suffer today is also because we've depended for a long time on aid, which is also administered by people who come from outside our boundaries with very little understanding of what exactly we experience and how we should solve it. And I think with what we are doing with mushrooms, converting waste that we produce ourselves while we starve, we are building a basis to actually teach people to start helping themselves.
I'm going to just before you do, I just got to quickly come in with you mentioned the question of aid and its implications. We have a question on that from Paul Asquith. I'll come back to the other panellists. Paul.
In my opinion, and in many Australians' eyes, foreign aid doesn't seem to be helping break the poverty cycle. So, Chido, in your opinion, what can we do to help make sure the money goes towards providing long-term solutions to help people survive and then hopefully thrive?
So we really need to change the approach and focus on solutions which are based on materials which are locally available. Aid so far has been administered most of the times by foreign organizations who send their people in to administer that. It has often been directed through the government. Now, if you know where I come from, we have challenges with the government. We have challenges with leadership in general, where if these are the people who are still going through so many challenges, who also administer the aid and only informed by the foreign organizations who come to deliver this, that is not going to work on the long term. It has failed so many times, billions of dollars, and we know it.
So it has to come from the
it has to come
bottom
from
up,
us.
like.
It has to come from us who grew up in these situations, taking the initiative, using what we know to work. And what I found to work at a young age is the mushrooms, and out of that, new other initiatives will come. And so I have to start, and yes, I'm not going to solve the 10% of our population, which is young orphans, in one go, but I will start where I can, and if those efforts can be multiplied, that this is what is going to change our situation.
Derryn wanted to jump in.
I was going to make a very frivolous comment. Am I the only person who puts coffee grounds on the balcony lemon tree? I mean, the coffee grounds are great for growing things.
Of course, they're not. I mean, you can grow lots of mushrooms, different kinds, some expensive ones as well. Yeah. So yeah.
Germaine.
Well, there are some other aspects of aid. In many cases, what we do when we make aid available is we get rid of our own surpluses, especially if they're not a particularly high value. And what that means is it makes it impossible for local farmers to farm at all, because it takes the value out of their produce. They can't compete with the subsidised stuff that's arriving. Now, most people don't understand that aid is an alternative economy, and it's revolting in many ways. For example, you've got a terrible disaster, a famine, war, whatever, and you've got brokers who are selling you aid supplies. And they are bargaining with you. They're saying, we got tents. You want them tomorrow? That'll be £500 a tent. You want it next week? That's less. You want it in a month's time? That's less. There are fortunes to be made in aid, and it's corrupting for everybody, especially for the people who are using their surpluses in this way. It's a very difficult thing to do, to actually give the power to survive to a community that is already extremely vulnerable to famine. You know, it's not simply drought, it's the people's inability to be defended against drought. They can't plan for the future, they can't build structures, they can't store their own produce.
And yet all of these things, by the way, just based on Chido's experience, it does seem that if you work from the community up, you can actually find your own solutions, as she has. You accept that?
Yes, but I wouldn't want to make it seem easy. I mean, I've been in Bangladesh, I've been in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is still on food aid. All this time after, 1984 and 1985.
Well, let's just ask the government about this. I mean, you've obviously lowered the aid budget. Is that because you don't think it's working?
No, absolutely not. We're still a generous country in relation to our foreign aid. It has to be well targeted. I agree with those comments. I think there are good aid programs, especially in microcredit and things that stimulate a whole range of the things that Chido is talking about. And, can I just say, Chido, I mean, you've been very humble about, some of your story and your experience, but actually, when you get to know your story and the adversity you've overcome and the things you're doing for other people, you're a role model for a lot of people, and it's inspiring. I think, I wouldn't want to go without saying that you're very inspiring in the work you're doing and what you're delivering. So from a government's perspective, I think sometimes we get criticised. Obviously, we have a big budget deficit, we have a huge debt in Australia, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to borrow more money to send overseas. We do send money in foreign aid. sometimes Australia is not recognised in the way they calculate these things. For example, in Africa, we provide $200 million worth of peacekeeping and security every single year. So that is not counted towards our overseas development assistance. And yet, if you're in Somalia and Australian warships are policing pirates, and piracy being one of the biggest impediments in local trade and your economy, you're very grateful to the Australian effort and the service personnel that do it. So we are a generous contributor in the world domain.
Tony Burke.
A few thoughts, if I may. And I don't think there's anything that this end from me along can say that's going to match what you've presented. I had 3 years as Agriculture Minister and discovered very quickly that in most countries of the world, it's not a trade portfolio. In most countries of the world, it's about feeding your population. And most of the farmers of the world are women on small blocks of land. Most of the aid, particularly through the World Food Programme, is not delivering finished products of food. Most of the work that I used to see during that time was work in helping with capacity building for the growing of food. There's an agency that often doesn't get talked about in Australia called ACR, which does extraordinary agricultural work, which sort of gets to that, teach people to fish and feed them for a lifetime argument. But I think the argument that Germaine makes is true in that if you just deliver food, you can wipe out the local farmers. You can wipe them out. You think you've done something good and you've actually wrecked the local economy. But my impression is increasingly the world has been doing that better, and I'd hate this discussion to leave people thinking, oh, the aid money's all wasted, because that's not what I think happens. Certainly, I hope Australia can also get to where the UK is at. The aid budget now, and I appreciate the arguments about how it's calculated, but it's still 25% below what it would have been. Theresa May has now got a policy on foreign aid, which means it's bipartisan over there. And I hope we can get that in Australia, because it is always going to be an awful form of lowest common denominator politics.
Okay, I'm just going to, just to end this part of the discussion, I want to go back to you, because you said something when you were talking earlier that maybe didn't sink in for everybody, but 10% of the young population are orphans. That's because of HIV and AIDS cutting a swathe through their parents, as it killed your mother. Sure. Is there a way that you can deal with that without foreign aid?
That's going to... We will need a part, which is, of course, the foreign aid, but we need to administer that in a sustainable way, where it's not just fixing a problem now and then the rest of the things. We need to find a way of using foreign aid to touch on all these problems in an integrated way. What do I mean with that? So if I am saying that my approach is using food to try and counter the impact of HIV and AIDS on orphans, to try and impact poverty in general, then I have to be able to select the right kinds of food which speak to all the issues that bring up poverty on this level in my country. So why do I choose mushrooms still today, since I was 11 years old? It's because we know already now there's studies that show the impact that mushrooms can have on the immune systems of people living with HIV and AIDS, for example. And so we are trying to look to say, when we say we're going to do something, how then do we feed the people now and at the same time address some of these issues around the immunity of the people? We work right now since 2013 until now in about 25 communities around Zimbabwe, where we have noticed that a lot of people were living with HIV and AIDS, for example, they're told you cannot eat meat anymore, so they are left most of the times only to eat vegetables, which is not enough for their overall health. When we introduce mushrooms in those communities, these are the people who are our first customers, and they buy the mushrooms because they are experiencing it's making a change on their health in general. So it's very, very important to find a holistic way where it's not just focusing on one thing, but also that aid is not just administered by the people on the higher level, but also the people on the lower level get to have a say in how this is administered.
What's the Mugabe government's attitude?
No, hang on, no, we've got to move on, because we've got time for just one last question. I'm sorry about that, Derryn. I'll come to you to answer this question anyway. The question comes from Richard Wiseman. It's a political one.
Question to Alex. Heading towards the next federal election, is the turmoil between Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull going to cost you government? And how do you see this matter being resolved?
Well, I think Derryn had a question.
Wrong government.
Okay,
Lucky
Alex,
last.
you're going to deal with this because we're talking about almost daily headlines now about strategic leaks against Abbott or strategic statements by Abbott which seem to undermine the Prime Minister.
Look, I don't think it's a big group of people involved. When I speak to Peter Dutton, as I do daily, about our portfolio work in immigration, we don't talk about this. When the Prime Minister speaks to me about the work of government, we don't speak about this. We speak about the work of government.
Is there a sort of cone of silence that comes over you?
There's not a cone of silence.
Headlines to say, "Oh, can't
There's
speak
not
about
a cone
that."
of silence. There's not a cone of silence. The point is we've just been re-elected to government for 3 years, and it would be remiss of us if we allowed ourselves to get into the Labor situation where we got completely and utterly distracted by it. And you won't see us. You won't see us doing that. I'll give you that guarantee. The team is very focused on governing the country and getting on with the job that we do.
You mean the whole team, including
the whole
Tony
team,
Abbott?
including Tony Abbott. The comments that people have made in recent times that he deserves and commands the respect of people are true. I respect him for the role he played in getting us into government and the things he's done. Of course, there's friction between a leader and a former leader, and there will be friction. There does seem to be a media obsession with that friction. In fact, you might have seen the very amusing scenario this week that said Tony Abbott's going to hop into the boxing ring with a Labor senator, which was just complete fake news. So the media tends to be this constant revolving circus of fake news where Tony Abbott's...
cut you off here. I wonder if the rest of the audience feels this way. I've said this before. I think this whole Abbott-Turnbull stuff is as boring as batshit.
Yeah.
I really do.
Good. Let's move on.
Just get on and run the government, you know?
Well, perhaps you could persuade people at high levels to stop leaking because suddenly Tony Abbott finds all this polling data about his own seat. It hasn't come from the press, it's come from
You'll have no argument from me, and whoever does that leaking has a nefarious motive, and they shouldn't be doing it. Absolutely.
OK, well, you should jump in on this. I imagine you have a point.
Let's go to the expert.
Look, I used to give answers like Alex just gave. And, people say, oh, your worst day in government's better than your best day in opposition. It's not true. Your worst days are when your own side's fighting. They're your worst days. It's awful.
Even when you're part of the fight.
Yeah, it is. It's an awful time. And one thing I learnt, when you change a first-term Prime Minister, you unleash an entire Shakespearean tragedy. And I watched it unfold, and we're watching it unfold again.
We've got a Shakespearean scholar here in Germaine.
It's time for a quote.
First of all, I mean, does this look very distant to you now, given that you're a joint citizen of the UK, which is now going to its own election with a Labor Party in serious crisis?
And with Theresa May still wearing those bloody leopard skin shoes. I think they must be her lucky shoes. Do you remember when she first came into Parliament, they made a great fuss about her shoes?
Let's not forget that you did get in trouble once on this programme for talking about what women
Well, but
wear.
this is the point about politics and trivia. I don't think anybody's interested in the sniping between Tony Abbott and the Prime Minister. It's very seldom the Prime Minister who actually responds to it. I mean, we could all wish that Malcolm somehow got his act together. He's infuriating because he's probably a lot smarter than Abbott, but you'd never know it because he's afraid to say anything. He's a bit like Obama. Obama, if it wasn't on teleprompter, Obama couldn't say it. He was so nervous about what construction might be put on it.
No.
Yes. He was an ineffectual president.
OK, I'm just going to, just to finish off, Chido, good leadership. I mean, I think Zimbabwe's probably had a bit of a paucity of it as well over about the last, 50 or so years. But what makes a good political leader?
I think a good political leader is made by a population of citizens who are actively engaged in choosing the right leader. Unfortunately, we have been stuck in that area. We haven't been awake enough to actually choose the right leader. But of course, the major reason is that we are struggling with the very, very basics. We cannot step up to the right level where we can actually demand the kind of leadership that we get. And so we still have a long way as a country to go actually to be able to build the leader that we want to have.
All countries probably need to demand the leader
We all have to.
that they really need.
It's not one person. You cannot blame it on a president. You cannot blame it on one person. It's all of us together. We need to step up and do something about our situation.
Well, that's a good time to stop because we have run out of time. Please thank our panel, Derryn Hinch, Germaine Greer, Alex Hawke, Tony Burke and Chido Govera. Thank you, and remember you can continue this discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and the Diversity Council's Lisa Anise. They're taking talk back and comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish. Now, next Monday on Q&A, the award-winning creator of the world's best political satires, including Veep and The Thick of It, Armando Iannucci, the Vice-Chancellor and CEO of the Australian National University, Nobel laureate Brian Schmidt, the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Tanya Plibersek, and the Research Director of Ipsos Mind and Mood, Laura Damasi. Until next week, good night.
Still got something to say? Join the discussion on Q&A.
Our full day of coverage begins at 4:30 with a special edition of News Breakfast live from the dawn service in Canberra.
Then live coverage of the Anzac Day March.
We all remember them.
And later, travel to Gallipoli and Villers-Bretonneux to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice.
Australia Remembers. Anzac Day 2017 on our ABC.
He's best known for entertaining children all over the world.
Take a seat.
Now, the Wiggles' Anthony Field opens up about his private struggles.
When you're in that zone, you feel like you shouldn't be on the earth.
And reveals his greatest achievement.
That's my proudest moment.